And like I said, welcome to Wisdom and Wine Live, hosted by Drakewell Museum and Park. As many of you know, every March, the museum hosts an annual lecture series. Unfortunately, circumstances made it so that we couldn't actually hold the majority of our lecture series this year. So we decided to shift some of our lectures online, and we did our first live lecture last week and with Jessica Hilburn, and this week Jennifer Burden has agreed to help us out and give her presentation, which was actually slated, I believe, it was supposed to be the last lecture in March. So we're very pleased to have Jennifer. Just a few logistics. Everybody's microphones are muted right now, simply so that we don't get a lot of background and feedback while Jen's giving her presentation. We ask that you keep them muted throughout. You are more than welcome to turn your camera on if you want to, but you do not have to have it on. And at the very bottom, if you haven't used Zoom before, at the bottom of the screen, in the middle of the icon bar, there is a chat bubble. That is the chat where you can type in questions or comments. We're going to do a question and answer after Jen is finished with her presentation. We had a lively question and answer last week. So I hope that we have the same this week. When the microphones are muted, it's hard to hear people clapping. If you look to the right of the icon bar, there is a smiley face reaction button. You can give Jen a thumbs up or some clapping if you want. Feel free to do so. I'm just going to do a quick introduction for Jen here, and then I'm going to turn things over to her. Jen Burden is the Historian-Educator at the Oil Region Alliance of Business, Industry, and Tourism, where she, as part of her job, oversees the operations of the Coal Oil Johnny House, which is a circa 1850 Greek Revival style house and was Coal Oil Johnny's boyhood home. In 2001, the house was relocated and reconstructed at its, or restored at its current location by the Wren Farm train station at the south end of Oil Creek State Park. The house is outfitted with historic displays and is available for private tours and open to the public for viewing at least once a year. Jen is going to present to us tonight the family histories and lasting impact of Coal Oil Johnny, the oil region's prodigal son. So we are very, very excited to have Jen and to learn what she has learned since she has started her research on Coal Oil Johnny. So I am going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to her. It's all yours, Jen.
Okay. Just before we get started, I figured Melissa gave an introduction for me, but just a little bit more about me. I'm a transplant to the oil region. I've been here now 3 years this month. I'm originally from the suburbs of Pittsburgh. I have an undergraduate degree majoring in history from Pitt, and I have a master's degree in historic preservation from Ball State University in the state of Indiana. I've been at ORA now for just over 2 years, and when I came on board, Marilyn Black, who is joining us tonight, one of the things that she assigned to me was everything Coal Oil Johnny. So this man's been a part of my life now for over 2 years. I'm going to try this, share my screen, and hopefully we'll go to a PowerPoint presentation. Oh. Melissa, what am I doing wrong? Oh, maybe.
At the bottom, there you go.
There we go. Can you see PowerPoint? Okay, good. make this look like a real PowerPoint here. So, talked about me, let's talk about this guy. Coal Oil Johnny is his nickname. Born John Washington Steele. And what I find really interesting about him, as we're going to talk about tonight, about his life and his impact on the region, is that it's a unique story in some parts of life during the oil boom along Oil Creek. Although, as we'll talk about, some parts are unique and some parts are not so unique for this area. So that's what I kind of like about it. It's the story of an average family. A lot of times the big wigs get all of the attention. We were lucky that John wrote a book at the turn of the 20th century, and so gave us some insight on not only his later antics, but just growing up in the region. And just as he moved into the 20th century, kind of shines a new light on how life was during the time he grew up and experiencing the oil boom, not only just in the region, but as he moved around the country. So let's start with the specifics. John Washington Steele was born December 12th, 1843, near Shakelyville in Mercer County. His parents were named Maria Folk and James David Steele. He had one older sibling named Permelia. She was about 2 years older than he was. As far as we can tell, Maria and James were not married in a legal sense. They may have had a common law marriage of some sort. But we do know is that in 1845, before John would have turned 2 years old, his parents split. James left the family and Maria was left with 2 very young children, which kind of left her in a precarious situation. And very shortly after, John and Permelia were adopted by Culbertson and Sarah McClintock, also pronounced McClintock. I tend to just go with McClintock, so forgive me for that. And from doing research on the families, we kind of know where the connection was. Culbertson had an older brother named Hugh. One of Hugh's descendants is on this call. And Hugh was living in Mercer County near this area at the time that Maria and James were together. And Culbertson and his wife Sarah had no children. Hugh, on the other hand, at this time, would have had 4 very young children. So my guess is that Hugh wasn't signing up. Hugh and his wife weren't signing up to take on 2 more kids to have a total of 6 children, probably under the age of at least 10, if not younger. And knowing that Culbertson and Sarah were childless, I think he was probably instrumental in making the adoption happen. So at the time that they were adopted, Permelia was about 3.5, John was 1.5. They always went by the last name of Steele. They never adopted the last name of McClintock. And throughout his book, John refers to Culbertson and Sarah as Uncle Culbertson and Aunt Sally. The McClintocks were typical people of Venango County in the 1840s. This is pre-oil boom, so they were farmers just like everyone else. I have a map here sort of blown up to show you the farm in question. Now this map is from 1857, so this is actually after Culbertson had passed. So you'll see the red box is highlighting the farm and it has J. McClintock. I assume that's in reference to John, as he would have been the male heir at this point. Aunt Sarah, Aunt Sally was still living at this point. And if you look 2 farms down, you'll see another McClintock. And there's others in this area, they just don't appear on this inset part of the map. Culbertson had inherited this farmstead from his father Hamilton, and his brother James, and also Hamilton, inherited land in Venango County, specifically from Hamilton. The house you see on the right, this is in its current location. You'll see the Rinn Farm train station in the background. The house was built about 1850 by Culbertson. It's Greek Revival style. And when it was moved, it was restored to its original look. It had some modifications over the years. At one point, there was a much wider porch. Off the back, there was always a kitchen addition, but that changed throughout the years. So when it was relocated, the original looking porch was put back on, and ORA decided not to rebuild the back wing, which for a small lot, it gives us a little bit more room. It also provides us with an ADA accessible entrance in the rear. Shortly after this house was built, Permelia, John's sister, died in 1851. She was only 10 years old. We don't know what she died from. Pennsylvania didn't require death certificates or death records until 1906. So that's been one of the big questions of what happened to her. John mentions, of course, her death in his book, but he does not give any details. 1855, Culbertson and his brother James actually died on the same day in March. And it's believed that this was an outbreak of tuberculosis. So in 1855, it's Aunt Sally and John are living here. You know, John would have still been young. He would only have been 11 or 12 years old when Culbertson passed. So skip ahead 4 years. Everyone on this call should know August 1859 that Drake strikes oil and is the first successful commercial producing oil well in the region. And because of that, speculators flood the area and are making deals with landowners. I mean, look up and down this map and we could tell a story about each of these names, especially those with land that are that goes across Oil Creek. So Sarah is making deals for leases and royalties for wells that are drilled on her land. Yes, when Culbertson died, his will stipulated that everything was to go to her until either she remarried or she died, and she did not remarry. A few years later, 1864, actually, let me back up real quick, sorry. When John was 19 years old, he got married. He got married to Eleanor Moffat, who was then 16. And they had met at church. They were both seceders, which is a form of Presbyterianism. 1 year later, in 1863, they had their only son, whose name was Oscar Culbertson Steele. 1864 in March, tragedy struck again to the family. Sally McClintock, probably like any other day, is starting the fire, and she throws some oil on there to get the fire going. And we've all seen women's dresses of the mid-19th century and how many layers there were. The fire was backdrafted and it caught her dress on fire. She survived just a day. She succumbed of her burns the following day. She also left a will, and everything went to John as her heir. So he gets the land that's outlined here on the map. He gets the house that's shown here. He is also now in charge of all of the royalties and oil leases that are on the land. And he gets all the possessions in the house. And one of these possessions included a safe that Sarah kept. And when he opens it, he finds about $24,000 in cash. And this is money that she had collected from the royalties that were coming in. And I say this every time I tell this story. Today, if I was granted $24,000 in cash, I'd be pretty happy. So just imagine in 1864, just how happy you'd be to get $24,000 in cash. And something else I want to point out here is that when this happens, John is 20 years old. And I think that's a key part of the story moving forward. Even though he's married and he's a father, he's still only 20 years old. News of John's newfound wealth spreads quickly and widely. John gets a new set of quote-unquote friends, the worst of which is a man named Seth Slocum, who was originally from Erie County. Seth seeks him out and befriends him, and the two of them become thick as thieves for the next few years. And Seth plays a really instrumental role in helping John spend his money and has a lot of influence over John on how he spends it, and never a good influence. Also about this time, Eleanor and Oscar, the baby, are ill, and it's decided that the family is going to go to Philadelphia to seek better medical treatment than what was available here. Also during this time, John's making deals or setting up deals for oil leases and talking about selling the property. He's receiving a lot of interest, a lot of which he pushes aside. He's not interested. Some of the offers are tempting. So in the middle of all this, he's also traveling back and forth. And when he ends up in Philadelphia and to meet up with his family, he finds that they're in quarantine because Oscar is ill. So he puts himself and Seth Slocum up in a hotel, and that's when things really start to go wrong. A man named William Wickham has been pursuing John with an offer to buy the farm for $1 million. John turns this offer down at least twice. And in further negotiations, the price is eventually up to $1.2 million with $30,000 cash up front that Wickham says will be 6 months rent for the property, so about $5,000 a month. And at the end of 6 months, if John can present a clear deed to the property, Wickham will pay out the rest of that amount. So 20-year-old John already has $24,000 in cash, and he's also making other deals. He's getting a lot of people, like I said, coming up to him with business deals, some of which he does take on, some of which he doesn't. So that's the deal. $30,000 cash now in 6 months. As long as he gets a clear deed, he will receive the rest of the money. And I bring up the clear deed part of it because Hamilton, the younger Hamilton McClintock, does contest the will and ultimately is not successful, but there is this going on as well. So there is some animosity going on. John was raised by the McClintocks since he was 1.5 years. They always viewed him as their son. So even though that there are other McClintock family members in the area, Culbertson and ultimately Sarah decide that John is their heir. Let's skip here to what I call at least the coal oil Johnny years. So this is a portrait of him on the left, about 1864. So he has come into his money, and this is a depiction of him decades later. We'll actually talk about this newspaper article a little later, but just showing kind of the extravagance that we're going to be discussing. So he starts his spending spree, and again, Seth Slocum is really instrumental in helping getting this going. The $30,000 he receives from Wickham, he keeps at the hotel that they're staying at because he didn't have a lot of faith in banks. The but Philadelphia being much larger, of course, than where we're at today, he's attracting even more attention. And a lot of it is his own doing, along with help from Seth and other, I'll call them hangers-on. Part of his spending spree, he talks about how he bought a custom-made carriage or a custom-painted carriage for about $1,600. He has it painted bright red. He has oil wells painted on them as on the carriage as a coat of arms. He even mentions in his book that he makes his drivers slow down at certain points so that people will gawk at them and draw attention. He and Seth have suits of clothes made. I think the newspaper article here depicts that pretty well. It was pretty garish. Again, it's attracting a lot of attention. They're buying diamond stick pins and other jewelry to, again, John's 20. And he has a lot of money and he has a lot of people helping him spend his money. Big things that they do, they're really into gambling and drinking. He's financing a lot of parties, especially at the hotel. And keep in mind, Eleanor and Oscar are back home in the Oil Creek Valley. John is doing this on his own. He does mention here and there in the book about he knows that this is wrong, but he doesn't come to grips with this until much later. So this is 1864. However, by early 1865, so less than 1 year later, because remember, Sarah she passes in March, John starts getting word of lawsuits and judgments coming his way. He owned property in Meadville. This is one of the purchases he makes after he comes into money. And that goes away. Wickham also pulls back on his deal. At the end of 6 months, he says that the land wasn't producing enough and he was no longer interested and that the deal was off. He also, in a very shady way, says that the $30,000 wasn't rent money, but was rather a loan, and he wants that money back. John says that was not the deal. It was rent for 6 months, and that if the deal went through completely, that would have been deducted from the overall total. So as these things are mounting, of course, other people are hearing about it, and creditors that, of course, he owes money to throughout Philadelphia for the goofy things that he's doing, they're starting to knock on the door as well. Because if he owes money to, a couple people, he owes money to a lot of people. And there's also a question about these predators. Some of them were legitimate. Some of them, he says he never even met, but they were all going through the courts. So he has a very short time of the good years, so to speak. He knows that it's time to leave Philadelphia. He also knows that the McClintock farm, needs to be sold for something. He actually turns the property over to Eleanor, who makes a deal to sell it for $20,000. The farm was officially transferred in 1866. And ultimately, even though she had a deal for $20,000, she doesn't get but $6,000 for the farm, and it's not until a couple years after that. So when he leaves Philadelphia, he does head back to the Oil Creek Valley, but I think he was too guilt-ridden to visit his family. He mentions making a few stops. He goes up to Titusville, and then he heads west. He mentions going to Cleveland and eventually Buffalo. And he's looking for work, and he's also looking for a way to escape his notoriety, but because he is recognized just about everywhere he goes. So he ends up in Kansas City, and lo and behold, he runs into two people who were probably honestly the best to him during the spending time. He had invested in a minstrel show called Skiff and Gaylord. They're the last names of two men. And he just by chance runs into them in Kansas City. He does mention that even though he had invested in their show, that he never made any money from it, but they offer him a job in which he willingly takes. He's desperate at this point. And so he travels with them. He mentions going to major cities. They go into Canada. They eventually make their way throughout New England. He is used as part of the bill to get people to the show. And he says he's comfortable with that because he understands it's going to bring people in, and if he's going to be gawked at, he'd rather, be under his own terms and actually making him money because he had lost so much. When he's in New England, he says 2 or 3 calls from home, letters from home saying to come back and live the straight and narrow and you would be welcome back. And kind of understandably, he's weary of that for all that he's done. And he knows that he's done wrong. He wasn't sure just how sincere that was or whether he should even go. But he does return in the fall of 1867. He is warmly welcomed home by Eleanor, even her father. Oscar, I think, needs to sort of be reintroduced to him because he hasn't been in his life for very long, and just sort of maybe here and there, maybe. When he does return, he starts farming with his brother-in-law. He also picks up other jobs. He goes to Franklin in 1868, and he works as a teamster. He works in the Rouseville Depot. The next year in 1869, he starts working at the depot. 1873, he goes to Pittsburgh to take a course, a business course. So the family is there for 4 months, but after his Philadelphia experience, and even though Pittsburgh is much smaller, he's ready to get out of there. So he does come back to Franklin. But his past keeps following him. Everyone knows who he is. Everyone comments about it. During the time that he spent in Philadelphia, he was drinking a lot, and he did, when he returned, he stopped. But he said, there was a lot of temptation because people knew of his antics and were constantly trying to get him to, fall off the wagon, so to speak. So he and his family are looking for a way to really escape the notoriety, and they end up going to Denison, Iowa. Putting this up here. And in Denison, again, he's just working normal jobs. He ends up working for a railroad. He's working, I believe, for a grocery store. He works at a grain elevator for a while, but the dust from the grain really weakens his lungs. So he doesn't stick with that for very long. And also while he's there, somebody from Franklin happens to come by. And at this point, everyone just knew him as John Steele, not Coal Oil Johnny. But it doesn't seem like this gentleman had any malice against him, but he does let it out that is Coal Oil Johnny. And so he and his family started getting harassed by newspaper writers. I wouldn't necessarily call them journalists at this point. Wanting interviews, wanting to dredge up the past, and this is the whole reason that they left. when his health weakens from working in the grain elevator, they end up relocating to Nebraska. First, they go to Lincoln for a few months, and then 1881, they end up in Kearney, Nebraska, which is the point here I have on the map. I just think it's kind of ironic that today, if you were going between, here I have Oil City and Kearney, you just jump on 80 and it'll take you right there. It is 1,100 miles and over a 16-hour trip, but just get on 80. They end up moving a few other times while they're in Nebraska for jobs. Oscar at this point is an adult, and Oscar stays in Nebraska with them. He does end up getting married, and he's working for the railroad as well. John mentions in his book that while he's in Nebraska, that he's traveling frequently back east, which I assume is the oil valley. There would be no other reason for him to go anywhere else. And he says one of the reasons he's traveling back is because there's somebody ill in the family. He doesn't mention who that is, and that's a good question of who that would be. We know that on his side of the family, there's, at least the nuclear family was so small. And at this point, the three that he was closest to are all gone. So it may have been somebody on Eleanor's side. He also became very close with St. John's Episcopal Church in Franklin, who helped him get sober and stay sober. He may have been traveling back for that. We do know he was in contact with his birth mother, Maria Folk. She ended up remarrying several years later to a man named David Amon, A-M-O-N. And in David Amon's obituary, it mentions that Maria is the birth mother of Coil Johnny, and that Johnny had promised her money when he had it, and that never came to pass. And when she died in 1912, there was also mention of her relationship with him. So there was some connection, although at this point, his traveling back east, this would have been the 1890s. Like I said, she lived until 1912. She actually lived into her 90s. So we're not sure who he's coming back to visit. In 1921, John does pass in Nebraska, and he's followed by Eleanor in 1926, and they are both buried in Nebraska. So what I want to talk about next is why we talk about this guy. Just kind of how famous was he? Why do we still find this character fascinating? And this map here illustrates what I thought was going to be a much easier and quicker exercise than what it ended up being. But each push pin on this map illustrates a city with a newspaper that mentions Coal Oil Johnny sometime between the late 1860s and 1922. So, until he passes. This was one database of newspapers, so there very well could be others. There are 474 push pins on this map, by the way. And this is just city. They're easily, especially in the larger cities, there's probably more than one paper that's mentioning him. All but 4 states, and at this point too, we're 1922, not all of these were even states yet. The only states that didn't have a mention of him were Colorado, Alaska, Rhode Island, and Maine. There's 2 in Canada that you can kind of see. There was even 1 in Australia. The other thing is that I only counted mentions of Coal Oil Johnny in reference to John Washington Steele. There were other people that went by that moniker. There was sort of a famous, quote unquote, man in Cincinnati that had his own run of bad luck and actually was a criminal. So he got a lot of press, but I didn't count him. I also didn't count when the term coal oil Johnny was just used generically. So these are specific references to John Washington Steele. So within the 60 or so years, almost 500 cities mention him. So he's a known figure. A lot of the articles that I came across were repeated articles, much like Reuters or an AP today. You know, the same article ran in several newspapers. A couple of years that stand out were, one was 1875, when it was discovered that he was in Iowa. That got a lot of press, so you can see why he was over being in Iowa and wanted to try somewhere else. Between 1888 and 89, a lot of press came out when John Waits bought the old Culbertson farm. After Eleanor sold it, it went through a couple holding companies or oil companies. But when John Waits bought it in the 1880s, he continued to produce oil from the land. It doesn't appear that the Waits ever actually lived there. That house was used, but more so for their tenants. And actually that property is still under Waits family ownership today. So well over 100 years. And of course, he's mentioned a lot in early 1922 after he passes. Surprisingly, when his book came out in 1902, there were very few mentions of him in the newspaper research. There was one in Franklin, there was one in Greenville. I believe it's the one in Greenville. It was sort of like just a short book review that mentioned it's a good book and it was $1.50. Other ways that his legacy persisted while he was alive, we already talked about the generic term of coal oil Johnny, and you can read the definition here. It was not a good thing to be called a coal oil Johnny. This definition came from a Victorian era dictionary. Another thing that it's kind of easy to find are coal oil Johnny's petroleum soap. He had no connection with the soap. Of course, because of that, he also got no money from its sales. I found ads for the soap from between about 1894 to 1912. So it was around for about almost 20 years at least. By 1904, it was a product of Procter & Gamble, another company that we still know today. These cards, so the card that's illustrated here, this is the front and back of one of the cards. And you can see in the fine print that if you turned in 10 of the wrappers, you got a set of these cards. For this one, you got a full set of 20. I found others, I think you got 25, the varying numbers. We have a handful of the original soap cards on display at the house. The one thing I've not seen though is the actual wrapper. Because it's like, wow, somebody had to be collecting them somewhere. I've heard that somebody has at least one in the region that she's promised to show me at some point. But they're just sort of pretty Victorian cards. Some of them are themed like this with children in sort of Victorian fancy costume, maybe you'd call it. Others are flower bouquets or flower arrangements. And then here's actually an advertisement for the Skiffin Gaylord show. If you've seen the fine print here, this was a show that took place in 1869, and this was in the Petroleum Center newspaper. So it appears that even though he wasn't traveling with them at this point, maybe because they were in the area, and of course he was here, they made an arrangement to use him as to pull in an audience. So after he passes in 1922, really any newspaper article mentions of him are very slim, few and far between. Occasionally there would be a mention of somebody visiting the area, remembering running into him. There was one, a Spanish-American war vet who said when he was a kid, Johnny used to give him a quarter for the newspaper, even though it only cost a penny or 5 cents. I don't know how true those types of stories are, because it wasn't, John didn't have a ton of money. He was just a regular working person. But he was well remembered in this area. Here I have some examples that even into the 21st century that he's being remembered. The Ballad of Coal Oil Johnny is a poem that was written fairly recently. The Atlantic had an article 10 years ago about, he found a record. It was the parable of Coal Oil Johnny. And just found that interesting. Of course, there's a fictionalized book of his life that was written in 2007. We have Bob Cannon. He now lives in Tennessee, but he's originally from the general region, and he kind of does, say impersonator, but he's like a sort of a motivational speaker, beware, don't do what this guy did. I was giving a version of this presentation last year at Westbury and Meadville, and when I popped up the slide, I heard this audible gasp from the audience. It's like, oh no, what happened? And a woman came up to me right after that, and she's like, that's my brother. So she was thrilled to see that he's getting recognition for this. I don't want to spend too much time, but if you go to YouTube, you can hear the Red Foley song by Coal Oil Johnny. And even though it's a very slow rhythm, it'll get stuck in your head. I'll warn you of that right now. So, I mean, he is certainly not as it was in the late 19th century, but he is still a character that people turn to now. And, how is he relevant now? At the ORA, we do a lot of programs since we own the house, like Melissa mentioned off the top. It is open for private tours, and we do have at least one public open house each year. Here's hoping that we get one in this year. If we do, it'll be in the fall. So keep an eye out for that if we can get through this. People are fascinated by coming into this house, because the one thing I really like about it is that it's a pre-oil boom house, and we don't have a lot of those in the region. We have these beautiful Victorian homes that oil money built. We have a lot of vernacular working class homes for when people flooded the area, they needed somewhere to live and somewhere that was close to the industry that they were working for. But we don't have many of the simple farmhouses for the people who were here before the boom. In my architectural historian background, I'm fascinated by this thing. We give presentations about his life, about his family, about other things that we learn randomly. Anytime we have one of these events, we at least have one person who comes from, as far from Erie in, sort of that general radius, saying, I'm related to him, but I don't know how, or I've been told something about him, but I don't know if it's true. So he still resonates today. And then even just for educational purposes, when we're talking about old homes, about his building preservation, about how to do genealogical research, how to clean headstones. We typically go back to him because we have a good full story of someone's life, and it's always nice when you're scrubbing a headstone to be able to talk about somebody with so much knowledge. And so on the right, you'll see Culbertson McClintock's headstone that we cleaned as part of a program in October of 2018. The bottom right picture, I took that photo last weekend. If you go to the Plummer Cemetery, Culbertson, Sarah, and Promelia are all buried in a row. And they're close to the church, and you will see them because they're the three whitest headstones in that part of the cemetery, at least, because of the cleaning that we did. And it's also kind of interesting, if you do go there, to look at them as a group, because of course Culbertson and Promelia died before the oil boom, and Sarah died shortly thereafter. Sarah's headstone is a thicker slab of marble. It has a little bit more decorative detail. So that's also another element of the story that we're able to tell. And then when you start looking around the cemetery, more of those pop out. So it's a good story. We're always learning something new and are always looking for a way to share that with everyone, because I think it's still relevant now. The story is over 150 years old, but it's one that resonates today. It's a greed story, it's a waste story, it's a redemption story, it's a forgiveness story. So it's something that we can still talk about. At this point, I'll stop talking. And if anyone has any questions, I will be more than happy to try to answer them. And I'll try to stop sharing my screen.
All right, I am looking in the chat box. We don't have questions yet, but I'm interested. I wrote a couple of things down that as I was listening to you. I saw that some of your push pins were in Canada.
2 of them.
I was wondering if you had done a broader kind of international search.
No, so I did a search through newspapers.com, and they just happened to have some international papers that popped up. Like I said, there was the 2 in Canada, there was 1 in Australia, and I want to say there may have even been 1 in England, but I could be wrong about that. But it just happens to be what they had. It's kind of weird just how many there are in Kansas, but that just could be because newspapers.com has a lot of Kansas papers.
Sure enough.
I think that this is still there's probably a lot more out there.
Let's see. Bill Stumpf has a question. What is engraved on the top of Culbertson's headstone?
It's a weeping willow tree, which is a pretty common motif. Even Sarah's headstone has that too.
And let's see. Diane wants to know how much $24,000 would be today. I'm trying to.
I meant to look that up before I came in. I did research a couple years ago on the Blood Farm, which is like 1 or 2 farms up the creek. And when the family sold that farm for between $500,000 and $600,000, that equated to almost 8 million, or just over 8 million in today's dollars. And I know that still doesn't quite answer. It's a very different amount of money, but several times more.
I just Googled it, and it's
thank you.
You're welcome. It's $746,356.
Yeah, crazy.
Ish, yeah.
Because again, it's like today, if you stumbled across $24,000 today, and it's not gonna put you on a spending spree in Philadelphia for 10 months, but it makes a significant difference in what you could do. So it's just amazing that 150 years later, we could talk about that amount of money and still find it relatable, knowing that it's $700,000 now. I mean, then that's just mind blowing. That, first of all, that's just in somebody's house in their safe.
Right.
Just makes me nervous. But I give Sarah credit. She seemed to know what she was doing.
Let's see. We have another question. Did he have a contract with Wickham?
It sounds like it was sort of a back of a napkin sort of deal. There was something written down, but it was in no way something that we would consider a legal document today. Like I said, Wickham had been on him here and there, and when he's in Philadelphia, Wickham seeks him out, and they make the deal at the hotel that John's staying at, and that's where it's done. So there's no notary, there's no bank person. And like I said, Wickham ends up twisting the story around, saying that, there was more to it, and John says, no, he took that as this is rent money for 6 months with the, whether or not the deal goes through or not at the end of 6 months. John talks about, I think it's in 1868, he actually goes through the bankruptcy procedure, and it's actually something that he wishes that he didn't do, because there were so many creditors after him, a lot with very questionable motives. Like I said, he even says one that he didn't even meet. So if he hadn't gone through bankruptcy, he would have had a better chance of countersuing and not being so much in debt. But because he went through bankruptcy, that goes out the window.
We have another question. Brenda would like to know if Oscar, the son, stayed in Nebraska.
Oscar actually dies young. In 1911, so 10 years before John dies, Oscar dies in Chicago. He was working for a railroad. I think it was the Burlington and something. And I've been meaning to dig a little deeper into that. I want to say I recall seeing something that he was in the hospital for a while, so it wasn't like a freak railroad accident like we talked about so much last week with Jessica. Mm-hmm. But he was working for the railroad, so there could have been an accident, there could have been something else. So even though he dies relatively young, he did get married, and he and his wife had 3 sons.
A follow-up to that, are there any known descendants alive today that we know of?
Possibly. Of course, the 3 sons, so Oscar has 3 sons. 1 son did not have any children. And the youngest son had 2 sons. And we know, actually Janet would know that Gene, is that right? He passed fairly within the past few years. His brother, I have not been able to find if he is still around. And his brother was born, I believe, in 1940. So there's a good chance, but I haven't, other than newspaper research saying that he gets married in the 70s, I haven't been able to find anything further on him. I think it's the middle son had a daughter, and she died in like 2002-ish. And then when you start getting into name changes through marriages, it gets really complicated. So there's probably somebody out there, but I just haven't been aware. And considering that John, Eleanor, and Oscar leave in the 1880s, I mean, and he comes back for visits, but he's no way, settling back here. Once he's gone, there's no family connection.
Let's see. Jason would like to know if there are specific episodes of extreme debauchery that occurred in Philadelphia.
The one reason that John gives for writing his book in 1902 is to kind of set the record straight. He's been, burdened with all of these stories, and he's very upfront when he's taking credit for it and saying, yeah, that happened, and boy, that was stupid. Excuse me. Like the carriage and the parties and the gambling and the clothes and the jewelry. But there's a story that he rents a whole hotel for a day. He goes into, and this is not the Gerard Hotel where, he makes his deal with Wickham and where he's staying in Philadelphia. This is a different hotel. And he goes in and he gets in an argument with the clerk, and he says, you don't know how to run a hotel, and makes some deal that he'll run the hotel for a day. He'll rent it for a day for $2,000. And so he makes this deal, and then he, buys everyone, cleans out the bar and all this stuff. And so in the book, he tells the story, and he's like, I've never stepped foot in that hotel. So there's a lot of that going on. He owns up to the gambling and the liquor and the luxuries. There's no whiff of cheating on his wife, even though she's not there, or even, making that happen for all these other friends of his, especially good old Seth. So, I mean, there's like wild stories, but not, not good stories, but especially compared to today, nothing I'd call debaucherous. Just, again, he was 20. He was 20 with $700,000 in his pocket. Think about a 20-year-old today and how that would end up.
We have a question about Seth. Actually, do we know what happened to Seth?
When John leaves Philadelphia because everything's gone awry, Seth leaves with him because everywhere John went, Seth went, because John was paying the way. And so they do come back to Franklin, and John kind of sits him down and says, we're done. Says, I've had enough. You're terrible. You've been horrible to me. I've been acting terribly, and you've been no help. I don't want to see you ever again. And all John mentions is that within a few years, Seth is dead. He mentions ill health, but no detail of if Seth continued his kind of partying ways and that's what led to his demise, or if it was something else. But according to John at least, he doesn't live very much longer after they part ways, and that would have been 1865.
And then Janet actually has some information about our question about descendants. Eugene Steele has 2 children, Michael and a daughter, whose name we don't know, and that this branch of the Steele family lived in the Boston area, but the family lived in Chicago for a good amount of time. So very cool. Thank you, Janet.
He had kind of an interesting life. And I'm not going to remember this off the top of my head, but he was actually a social worker in Chicago. And so he was actually pretty progressive and had an impact on agencies that he worked with. And then, he ended up in Massachusetts.
Very good. I don't see any other questions, so I am going to say thank you very much, Jen, and a round of applause, everybody. It was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned into our Facebook page at Drakewell Museum for other live events or other things that we have going on. And everybody, please do take care of yourself. And I hope to see you again soon. Bye, everybody.